there is a city at the bottom of the ocean that nobody has ever found. It had concentric rings of water and land, a harbour so vast it could hold the fleets of 100 nations, temples roofed in silver, and walls coated in a metal that glowed like fire. It was ruled by the descendants of a god. It conquered most of the known world, and then, in a single day and night, it sank beneath the Atlantic and vanished so completely that no trace has ever been confirmed. The story is roughly 2,400 years old. And here is the thing that makes it strange. It does not feel like a myth. It feels like a report. Most ancient legends have that dreamlike quality, that sense of things being slightly out of focus. Heroes doing impossible things in places that feel more like moods than locations. But Atlantis is oddly specific. It gives you coordinates. It gives you architectural details. It gives you a timeline with numbers attached. It tells you the city was beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which is what the ancients called the Strait of Gibraltar. It tells you the island was larger than Libya and Asia combined. It tells you the whole catastrophe happened 9,000 years before the telling. That level of specificity is either the mark of something rooted in genuine memory, or it is the mark of an extraordinarily skilled writer who knew exactly what details would make a story feel true. Both possibilities are worth taking seriously. People have been searching for Atlantis, arguing about Atlantis, writing about Atlantis, and dismissing Atlantis for most of recorded history. The searches have taken people to the Azores, to the Canary Islands, to the coast of Spain, to the Caribbean, to Antarctica, to the bottom of the Mediterranean, to Scandinavia, to Peru, and to at least a dozen other places depending on which book you pick up. There have been serious archaeological expeditions, and there have been deeply unserious ones. There have been satellite surveys and sonar scans and expeditions funded by people who were absolutely certain they were about to change everything. None of them have delivered anything close to definitive proof. What we are going to do here is something different. We are not going to find Atlantis tonight, because nobody has. What we are going to do is trace where the story actually came from. We are going to look at the world that produced it, the man who wrote it down, the sources he claimed to be drawing from, and the handful of real historical events that scholars think might be hiding inside the legend. By the end, you will not have a location, but you will have something more interesting than a location. You will have an understanding of why this particular story has refused to stay buried for over 2 millennia, why it keeps resurfacing every few generations looking slightly different, but always recognizable, and what it might actually be telling us about the ancient world and about ourselves. If you are listening to this right now, I want to know where you are and what time it is. There is something genuinely strange about the geography of a sleep channel. It is simultaneously midnight in one place and early morning in another, and someone is probably listening on a lunch break somewhere. Drop it in the comments. I read them. It is one of my favourite things about making these. And if you want to listen without any ads, without any music, just the story, you can follow the channel on Spotify. The link is in the description. It costs nothing. It just makes the listening experience a little cleaner, a little quieter, which feels right for a story about a lost city beneath the sea. Now, the single most important fact about Atlantis, the fact that shapes everything else we are going to discuss, is this. There is one source. One. Everything in the Atlantis tradition, every map, every expedition, every theory, every novel, every documentary, every argument at a dinner table, every late-night internet rabbit hole, it all flows from a single philosopher writing in ancient Athens around 360 BCE. His name was Plato, and if Plato had not written 2 specific dialogues, texts known as the Timaeus and the Critias, the word Atlantis would mean nothing to anyone alive today. This is worth sitting with for a moment. We are talking about a story that has inspired centuries of genuine scholarship, that has launched actual expeditions, that has shaped how people think about prehistory and civilization and catastrophe, and the entire tradition rests on a few dozen pages written by one man more than 2,000 years ago. There is no earlier source. There is no independent confirmation from another ancient writer describing the same place. There is no physical artifact, no coin, no tablet, no inscription that mentions Atlantis before Plato does. That does not automatically make the story false. It does not mean Plato invented it from nothing. Plato himself claimed he was passing along a much older account, one that had travelled through Egypt and through a chain of storytellers before reaching him. Scholars have spent considerable energy trying to evaluate that claim, and the answer is genuinely complicated. What we can say with confidence is that Plato was not a casual storyteller. He was one of the most sophisticated philosophical minds of the ancient world, and he had very specific reasons for constructing the story the way he did, reasons that go beyond simply wanting to entertain people. Understanding those reasons, understanding what Plato was trying to do and why, is the key that unlocks almost everything interesting about where this legend came from. And to understand Plato, we need to understand the world he was living in. A world of crumbling empires and democratic experiments, and of Athens that had recently survived the impossible and was not entirely sure what came next. A world where the past felt enormous and mostly lost, and where the sea was still the edge of everything known. That is where we are headed into the world that made Plato, and the story he decided to tell inside it. Athens in 360 BCE was a city that had survived something it probably should not have survived, and was still trying to figure out what that meant. 40 years earlier, Athens had lost the Peloponnesian War. This was not a minor military setback. This was a total collapse. The war against Sparta and its allies had gone on for 27 years, had consumed an entire generation, had ended with Athens besieged, its fleet destroyed, its empire dismantled, and its famous democracy temporarily abolished in favour of a brutal oligarchic regime backed by Spartan soldiers. The long walls that had made Athens feel invincible were torn down. The city that had commissioned the Parthenon, that had produced Sophocles and Thucydides, that had positioned itself as the intellectual and cultural centre of the Greek world, was brought to its knees. Democracy was eventually restored. Athens rebuilt. It even managed to regain a degree of influence in the decades that followed. But something had broken that could not be fully repaired. The confidence was gone. That sense of Athenian exceptionalism, the belief that this particular city represented something genuinely new and better in the world, had been badly shaken. And in the aftermath of that shaking, Athenian intellectual life turned toward a question that feels very familiar. What went wrong? And was there a way to do things better? This is the world Plato grew up in. He was born around 428 BCE, when the war was already underway. He watched his city suffer the plague, lose its generals, exhaust its treasury, and make a series of catastrophic strategic decisions. Most personally, he watched Athens execute Socrates in 399 BCE, just a few years after the war ended, charging his teacher with impiety and corrupting the youth. For Plato, this was not an abstraction. This was democracy at its worst, a city that had survived everything turning around and killing the most honest man it had produced. So when Plato began writing his dialogues, he was not writing for entertainment, and he was not writing history in any sense that we would recognize. He was writing philosophy as a kind of medicine. His project across dozens of texts was to think through the deepest questions of politics and virtue and human nature. What makes a just city? What makes a good person? What kind of knowledge actually matters? And what do we only think we know? The dialogues put Socrates in conversation with various interlocutors, sometimes drawing them toward uncomfortable truths, sometimes letting them expose their own confusions. It is a deliberately indirect form of argument. Plato rarely just tells you what he thinks. He shows you the thinking. The Republic is the most famous product of this project, a sprawling exploration of what an ideal city might look like. But Plato also returned repeatedly to questions about political decay, about how good societies collapse, about what Athens might have looked like before it became Athens. These were not idle historical questions. They were urgent practical ones. If you could understand how civilizations fail, maybe you could understand how to stop the failing. Into this intellectual climate, stories about ancient catastrophes fit perfectly. Greek culture already had a deep habit of looking to the distant past for moral lessons. The Trojan War was not just a story about a siege. It was a meditation on heroism, pride, loyalty, and the costs of hubris. The flood myths that appear across Greek literature, Deucalion surviving the great deluge while the corrupt world drowned around him, these were not geological reports. They were moral architectures. The catastrophe was always the consequence. The survivor was always the lesson. Plato understood this structure completely. He had grown up with it, written within it, and was sophisticated enough to use it deliberately. When he reaches for the device of an ancient, destroyed civilization in the Timaeus and Critias, he is reaching for something his audience would have known how to read. A story about a great power that became corrupt and was destroyed is not a news bulletin. It is a philosophical instrument. There was also something specific, drawing Athenian imagination westward. Greek geographical knowledge in Plato's time was real but limited, and the limits themselves were intoxicating. The Greeks knew the Mediterranean well. They had sailed it, colonized it, traded across it for centuries. But beyond the Strait of Gibraltar, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the knowledge became thin and the speculation became thick. There were rumours of islands, there were sailors' accounts of vast swells and strange currents. Carthaginian explorers had pushed down the African coast. There were stories of land beyond the ocean that nobody had confirmed. The far west was simultaneously the edge of the known world and a blank space where anything could exist. For a writer constructing a story about a lost civilization, it was perfect. Greek audiences had also grown up in a landscape that regularly reminded them of catastrophe. The Mediterranean sits on active geological fault lines. Earthquakes were common enough to be part of ordinary experience. Tsunamis had struck coastal settlements within living memory of various generations. There was a particularly devastating earthquake and tsunami in 373 BCE, just a decade or so before Plato was writing his Atlantis texts, that destroyed the city of Helike on the southern shore of the Gulf of Corinth. The city sank. You could apparently still see its ruins under the water. People knew this had happened. It was recent, it was documented, and it was exactly the kind of event that would make a story about an island civilization swallowed by the sea feel not just plausible, but almost obvious. Real geological events fed the imagination without becoming literal history. They created a kind of emotional plausibility, a sense that the world was capable of doing terrible things very quickly, and that what the sea gives it can take back. Wars did the same work. Greek audiences had seen cities destroyed, populations enslaved, entire cultures effectively erased. They did not need much convincing that great powers could vanish. They had watched it happen. Now here is something worth holding on to as we go deeper into the story itself. When an ancient audience sat down to hear a philosophical dialogue read aloud, which is how these texts were most often experienced, they were not expecting what we expect from a documentary or a history book. They were expecting a conversation. They were expecting ideas to be explored, tested, pushed to their limits. They were expecting the author to use whatever tools were available, including invented speeches, invented interlocutors, invented scenarios, to get at something true. The question was not, did this literally happen? But what does this illuminate? This creates a genuine problem for modern readers approaching Plato, and it is a problem worth naming directly. We live in a world that has sharp categories. Fiction is fiction. History is history. If someone tells you a story about a real place with real dates and real architectural measurements, you assume they are making historical claims. But Plato was writing in a tradition where those categories were much more fluid, where a story could be constructed, elaborated, even invented outright, in service of a philosophical point, and the audience would understand this without needing it explained. That does not mean Plato made everything up. It does not mean there is no real history embedded somewhere in the Atlantis story. Scholars who have spent careers on this question are genuinely divided, and we will look at the evidence carefully. But it does mean that reading the Critias the way you would read a Wikipedia article is going to lead you somewhere Plato never intended to take you. He was not filing a report, he was building an argument. The city he describes, its perfection and its corruption, its war against an idealized Athens, its ultimate destruction, all of it is doing philosophical work. Understanding what that work is changes everything about how the story should be read. This is where we need to go next, because before we can weigh the theories, before we can evaluate the geology or the archaeology or the Egyptian records Plato claims to be drawing from, we need to look at the actual text. At the moment, Atlantis first appears on the page in the voice of a man who says he is not making any of this up. When Atlantis finally walks onto the stage, it does not announce itself with trumpets. It arrives in the middle of a conversation. The dialogue is called the Timaeus, named after one of its speakers, and it opens like many of Plato's works do. Socrates is talking with friends, reviewing a previous day's argument about the ideal city. They've sketched out a theoretical Athens, a perfectly ordered polis with guardians and philosopher rulers, and a careful balance of classes and education. Socrates, being Socrates, is not satisfied with leaving the city on the page. He says, in effect, "Yesterday we built a city in words. Today I'd like to see that city tested. I want a story that shows this ideal community in action, meeting real dangers, facing real enemies, proving that its structure is not just beautiful but effective. Can someone give me that?" This is the framing device. The story of Atlantis does not drop from the sky. It is offered as an example, a kind of thought experiment wrapped in a historical claim. Socrates asks for a demonstration of the perfect city. Critias steps forward and says, "I have one." That detail matters, because Critias is not a neutral character. In the dialogue, he is presented as an elderly, respectable Athenian, claiming to remember a story he heard as a child from his grandfather, who heard it from the famous lawgiver Solon, who supposedly heard it from Egyptian priests. It's a long chain of memory, stretching back centuries. But in the real world, for Plato's contemporary audience, the name Critias carried a heavy resonance. The historical Critias was one of the 30 tyrants, part of the oligarchic regime that ruled Athens briefly but brutally after the Peloponnesian War. He was known for his intelligence, his rhetorical skill, and his ruthlessness. He was, in a sense, a symbol of what happens when cleverness is cut loose from justice. Plato gives that name to his storyteller. We can't know exactly how literally he meant that connection. The Critias of the dialogue is an older man than the real Critias ever became. The timelines do not line up neatly, but the choice is not accidental. The storyteller in Plato is almost never just a delivery mechanism. Who speaks shapes what is being said. So when this Critias promises Socrates a true account, we need to hear that phrase in context. In Greek, the expression he uses has a flavour like genuine or trustworthy, as opposed to merely invented. He contrasts it with the kind of mythic tales poets make up from scratch. This is, he insists, not that. This is something that has come down from priests who keep records, from a lawgiver who went abroad to learn, from his own family's careful transmission. Some modern readers take that as a straightforward guarantee. Plato is telling us this literally happened. But in the culture Plato was writing for, the line was not that clean. Calling a story true could mean many things. It might mean this comes from a respected tradition, Or this is a story with a serious moral core, not a frivolous fable. Or even, I want you to listen to this as if it were history, so that its lessons will land with their full weight. It is also perfectly compatible with the possibility that Plato is blending bits of real geography, real memories of disasters, and real political reflection into something more crafted than copied. Ancient authors did that all the time and still called their narratives true in the sense that mattered most to them. True to character, true to the gods, true to the patterns they saw in human affairs. What Critias then begins to describe is striking not just for what it includes, but for how quickly the core themes come into focus. Before you hear anything about concentric rings or canals, you hear about power. He speaks of an ancient Athens, extremely old by his reckoning, living in a kind of golden age of virtue and simplicity. Opposite it, across the sea, is Atlantis, a great island kingdom beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Atlantis is immediately framed not as a quaint remote culture but as an empire. It rules over many other islands. It controls parts of the opposite continent. Its kings command a formidable navy and army. Wealth appears alongside power. Atlantis is described as rich in metals, including a mysterious shining metal called orichalcum. The land is fertile. The engineering is grand. The city's layout is carefully ordered. From the very first paragraphs, you are invited to imagine not just a place, but an infrastructure of abundance. This is not a struggling backwater that gets unlucky. This is a success story, and with success, almost automatically in Greek storytelling, comes hubris. Plato does not wait until the end to reveal the moral curve. Very early he tells you that Atlantis begins well. Its first kings are half divine, descended from Poseidon and a mortal woman. They live in moderation. They respect the gods. Their wealth does not yet corrupt them. Then, as generations pass, the divine part in them diminishes. The mortal element becomes stronger. They grow greedy, ambitious, unjust. They use their power to dominate rather than to lead. Their empire becomes predatory. By the time Atlantis launches its war of expansion, trying to subdue Athens and much of the Mediterranean, the ending is already morally overdetermined. A Greek audience would recognize the pattern: power, pride, overreach, collapse. The downfall is not a twist. It is the point. This is the architecture Plato gives you up front. Old virtuous Athens, rich expansive Atlantis. A clash between a just city and a corrupt empire. The gods watching. A reckoning coming. And all of it is filtered through the particular device of the dialogue. That format changes how the story functions. You never hear Plato say in his own voice, Atlantis existed in such and such a year. You hear characters with their own motives and limitations, recounting and interpreting. Socrates asks for an example. Critias offers one. Timaeus will later launch into a cosmology. Critias will then start elaborating the Atlantis story in its own dedicated dialogue, also called Critias. This means that what is said is always, in a sense, on stage. It is performance inside performance. There are places where Socrates presses, where other speakers respond, where the conversation steers what emerges and what remains implied. There are also silences, questions we might want answered as historians: exact dates, precise locations, corroborating evidence, are not the questions the characters are interested in, so the text does not pause to satisfy them. And then there is the strangest thing of all: the story stops. The dialogue Critias is famously unfinished. We have a long, careful description of the island, its rings of land and sea, its temples, its political system, its wealth. The setup for the great war with primeval Athens is in place. The moral arc has been sketched. And then, in mid-flow, the text breaks off. The manuscript simply ends. We do not know why. Maybe Plato died before finishing it. Maybe he abandoned it. Maybe the rest was lost in transmission. Ancient testimonies are inconclusive. What we do know is what that abrupt silence did to later imaginations. It opened a space. If the story had rolled on to a neat conclusion, carefully explaining every detail of the war and the destruction, and tying it back explicitly to Plato's philosophical themes, there would be less room to maneuver. Instead, we are left on the edge of the great conflict, with only a brief summary in the Timaeus telling us that earthquakes and floods came, that Atlantis sank in a single day and night, that the sea became muddy and impassable. That gap between the rich beginning and the lost ending is where centuries of speculation have lived. Commentators, ancient and modern, have been trying to finish Plato's sentence ever since. They have tried to locate the island, to match the catastrophe to real events, to guess what Plato might have said if he had one more scroll, to see how those guesses started, and how the supposed true account of an Egyptian archive turned into a chain of retellings. We have to follow the story one step further back, to the place where Plato says it came from. Plato gives you a very specific chain. He does not say, "I made this up last week." He says, "There were priests in Egypt, in the city of Sais in the Nile Delta. They kept ancient records. The Athenian lawgiver Solon visited them. They showed him the story of Atlantis and of a very ancient Athens. Solon brought it home and planned to turn it into a poem, but never finished. Instead, he told it to Dropides. Dropides told it to his son, Critias the elder. Critias told it to his grandson. Critias the younger, who as an old man is now telling it to Socrates. Plato, in turn, is putting that conversation into writing. Priests, Solon, Critias, family, Plato's dialogue. That is the official route. Each step in that chain is doing work. Start with Solon. In the Greek world, Solon is not just any traveller. He is one of the 7 sages, a poet, a reformer, a man credited with reshaping Athenian law and steering the city away from civil war. He is the kind of figure you invoke when you want your story to feel rooted in civic memory, in public seriousness, in something more than tavern gossip. By Plato's time, Solon also belonged to a particular genre of story. There were tales about how he had gone abroad during his self-imposed exile, visiting Egypt, Cyprus, maybe Lydia. He asks questions, he gathers wisdom, he compares laws. In some versions he chats with kings, in others he studies foreign customs. He is a prototype of the Greek intellectual pilgrim, travelling to see older civilizations and bring back their knowledge. Attach Atlantis to Solon, and you immediately raise the stakes. This is not a random sailor's yarn. This is something a lawgiver took seriously enough to research, to translate, to shape into poetry. That gives it a dignity a mere myth would not have. It also gives Plato a way to connect his philosophical city, the ideal Athens discussed by Socrates, with the real political reforms of a revered ancestor. Then there is Egypt. To a Greek audience in the 4th century BCE, Egypt is ancientness made visible. Herodotus, writing a few generations before Plato, calls Egypt the gift of the Nile and describes its temples and customs with a mixture of fascination and bafflement. Egyptian priests claimed continuous records stretching back thousands of years. Their monuments looked older than anything in Greece. Their scripts were mysterious. Their rituals were elaborate and strange. In the Greek imagination, Egypt becomes a storehouse of deep time. If you want a story to reach back beyond the horizon of Greek memory, beyond the Trojan War, beyond Hesiod's Ages of Man, Egypt is one of the few plausible places to anchor it. Not because Greek writers had detailed knowledge of Egyptian chronology, but because Egypt symbolized continuity, archives, and the patient keeping of records. Plato leans into that symbolism. In the Timaeus, the Egyptian priest gently scolds Solon. "You Greeks," he says, "are like children. You have no very old traditions, no ancient learning, because every so often catastrophes sweep over your lands and wipe out your stories." Your cities are destroyed. Your people start again from scratch. You remember only the most recent cycle. Meanwhile, in Egypt, the floods are gentle, the records endure, the temples stand, and the scribes keep copying. It is a powerful image, a civilization that remembers what others have forgotten. Within that framework, the priest then produces the tale of a war 9,000 years earlier, when primeval Athens resisted the aggression of Atlantis. 9,000 years before Solon, not 900. Not a long time ago in mythic language, but a precise, enormous number. This is where modern eyebrows tend to go up. 9,000 years before Solon would place the events around 9,600 BCE, long before any known city in Greece or Egypt. Long before the kind of temple bureaucracies that would keep written archives. It is also suspiciously close to certain later esoteric chronologies, which seized on that number as proof of a lost age. But numbers are slippery things. In transmission from Egyptian to Greek, you are moving between languages, between calendars, between ways of reckoning time. Egyptian priests used different systems: civil years of 365 days, lunar cycles, regnal lists of kings. Greek visitors tried to map those onto their own genealogies and festival calendars. Mistakes, confusions, and exaggerations were easy. Some scholars have suggested that 9,000 might be a mistranslation or a deliberate inflation. Perhaps the priest said 900, and the Greek heard it wrong. Perhaps the number refers not to solar years, but to months or ceremonial cycles. Perhaps Plato himself chose a very large figure to push the story so far back that no audience member could reasonably expect confirming evidence. We do not know. What we can say is that large round numbers in ancient texts often function more as signals of deep antiquity than as precise dates. When Herodotus reports that Egyptian priests traced their line of kings back 11,340 years, he is not giving a modern chronological table. He is translating a sense of vastness into the language of arithmetic. Even if you set aside the question of years, there is another frailty in Plato's chain: human memory. Think of the root again. Solon hears a story in Egypt. He translates it, perhaps partially, perhaps with poetic additions. He brings it home. He recounts it to friends. It is passed down within a family for several generations before Plato writes it down, shaping it into a dialogue with philosophical aims. In theory, each link in the chain is careful. Critias insists that the story was told on a special occasion when everyone resolved to remember it accurately. He even explains how, as a boy, he practiced reciting it at a festival. This is Plato showing his work, giving you reasons to trust the content. But memory does not work like stone. Oral transmission, even when people try to be faithful, is transformative. Details compress, speeches get sharper, motivations become clearer in hindsight. Foreign names are Hellenized, chronologies are adjusted to fit local frameworks. People forget, and then unconsciously repair the gaps with familiar patterns. Modern psychologists have watched how real events turn into stories in just a few retellings. Jokes tighten. Heroes become braver. Coincidences look like fate. No malice is required, the mind edits automatically. Applied to Atlantis. That means you can imagine a spectrum. At one end is the strict historical reading. Solon really did hear a record of a specific island civilization from Egyptian priests, and Plato is preserving it, distorted only by the ordinary erosion of time. At the other end is the literary reading. Plato picked up vague notions about Egyptian antiquity, older floods, and forgotten wars, attached them to a famous lawgiver, and built from them a largely crafted parable about virtue and imperial overreach. Most scholars fall somewhere in between. They find it fully plausible that Solon travelled to Egypt, that he spoke with priests, that Egyptian tradition included stories of great floods, of older peoples, of conflicts with sea peoples or Western enemies. They note that Greek authors often used Solon as a conduit for foreign wisdom. They see nothing impossible about a family preserving a cherished tale, and Plato using it. What they doubt is the precision of the historical package. The 9,000 years, the detailed constitutional structure of Atlantis, the exact layout of rings and canals, the neat mirroring between old Athens and Plato's ideal city. These look to many readers less like what an Egyptian priest would have read from a dusty scroll, and more like what a philosopher would design to make his political points vivid. That brings us back to why Egypt appears at all. Plato could have said there is an old Greek story about a vanished island. He does not. He explicitly sends his lawgiver to a foreign archive. That move accomplishes several things at once. It lets him talk about cycles of destruction and rebirth stretching far beyond ordinary Greek chronologies. It flatters Greek self-image by having an Egyptian priest recognize Athens' ancient virtue. It gives his true story a documentary feel. This is not mere bardic invention. It is something written, stored and certified by a venerable temple bureaucracy. And at a subtler level, it allows Plato to stage a meeting between two kinds of knowledge. On one side, Athens, the city of philosophy, argument and political experiment. On the other, Egypt, the land of stable tradition, ritual and records. The Atlantis story emerges at their point of contact, as if to say, when restless inquiry meets deep memory, you get a glimpse of patterns that individual lifetimes cannot see. Whether that glimpse is a literal map of a lost island or a constructed mirror for Plato's own concerns is the question that has haunted interpreters ever since. For the purposes of the dialogue, though, the chain has done its job. It has carried a tale from the depths of imagined antiquity into the living room of Socrates. It has wrapped a philosophical exercise in the clothing of history. It has planted Atlantis in a space that is just plausible enough to tempt belief, and just distant enough to resist easy verification. From that position, Plato is ready to start filling in the map. The seas, the straits, the island beyond the Pillars of Hercules, and the way he bends real geography to fit the needs of his story. For a Greek audience, the phrase "beyond the Pillars of Hercules" lands with a particular weight. The pillars are not a fantasy. They are a place. Greeks used that name for the straits we now call Gibraltar, where the Mediterranean narrows and meets the open ocean. Sail west along the coasts of Spain and North Africa. Keep going until you hit the bottleneck of land and water at the far end, and you're at the pillars. Inside the straits is the familiar sea, the wine-dark Mediterranean, ringed by coastlines full of harbours, islands, trading posts, colonies, stories. A space with named winds, predictable seasons, maritime handbooks, and an entire literature of shipwrecks and rescues and merchant runs. By Plato's time, Greek sailors and Phoenician sailors had been looping through that basin for centuries. Outside the straits is something else. They called it the Atlantic, but not in the modern sense of a charted world ocean with measured depths and mapped currents. For them, it is the outer sea, the encircling sea hinted at in older myths, a place of long swells, stronger tides, strange fogs, and coastlines that run on and on into rumour. So when Plato has his Egyptian priest say that Atlantis lay in front of the Pillars of Heracles in the Atlantic Sea, he is doing two things at once. He is locating the island at the edge of the known world, and he is stepping just slightly off the map, because beyond the pillars is not only a direction, it is a symbol. Already in earlier Greek literature, the West and the outer ocean are where you put things that do not quite fit inside normal geography. The islands of the blessed, the garden of the Hesperides, the place where the sun goes down and the dead go out of reach. Heracles himself, the hero whose name marks the straits, travels there on his labours. It is the right neighbourhood for a story that is supposed to feel both grand and unreachable. Into that space Plato drops a very bold claim. The island of Atlantis, he has the priest say, was larger than Libya and Asia together. To modern ears, that sounds like a continent dwarfing Africa and Asia. But the Greek terms are not quite the same as ours. Libya, for a classical Greek, is not the entire African landmass. It usually means the stretch of North Africa that curves along the southern Mediterranean coast, from roughly Egypt to somewhere west of Carthage. Asia often refers only to Anatolia and the coastal territories of the Persian Empire facing the Aegean and eastern Mediterranean. So Libya and Asia can mean something like the known southern and eastern coasts that frame our sea, not everything from the Cape of Good Hope to the Himalayas. Even so, larger than both is extravagant. It is supposed to be extravagant. Ancient writers used size like they used numbers, as a way to signal significance more than to convey measurements. A land, larger than Libya and Asia, is not a place you can sail around in a week. It is a world in itself, big enough to hold multiple regions, kings, peoples, a rival to the entire civilized ring around the Mediterranean. At the same time, Greek vocabulary does not sharpen the boundary between island and continent the way we do. They had words that distinguished a mainland from an island, but an island could be very large. You could call something Nasos, island, even if it was more like what we would call a subcontinent, as long as it was thought of as surrounded by water or separated from your own land by sea. You could also hear rumours of a great island far away and interpret them elastically, stretching a report of a distant shore into the idea of a single enormous landmass. So when Plato says island, you should not imagine a tidy, clearly bounded shape the size of, say, Crete sitting in the mid-Atlantic. You should hear a great tract of land accessible by sea, distinct from the familiar shores, conceived as a unified realm for the purpose of the story. To make this feel more real, Plato adds another detail. From Atlantis, he says, there was a way to other islands, and from those islands to the opposite continent that truly surrounded the whole sea. This is a striking line. Within the dialogue, it functions like a stepping stone route across the outer ocean. Atlantis is not just a solitary mass beyond the straits. It is the first stop on a chain that leads to more land, and then to a farther shore that enfolds the ocean entirely. Some modern readers have seen in this a prophetic glimpse of the Americas, that moves well beyond what the evidence can bear. There is no sign that Plato had concrete information about lands across the Atlantic, but he does seem to be playing with two ideas that were in the air. First, that there might be more islands in the ocean beyond the pillars, reachable in stages, much as the Greeks knew that if you hop from island to island across the Aegean, you can get from Greece to Asia Minor. Second, that the world is in some sense enclosed by land, that the ocean you can sail on is a belt of water bounded somewhere beyond sight. Not because anyone had circumnavigated the globe, but because many ancient cosmologies imagined a finite, structured world rather than an endless expanse. For Plato's listeners, this would make Atlantis feel oddly plausible. It sits at the gates of a possibly vast, vaguely imagined outer geography. It connects the known sea to the unknown world. It is a liminal place, a threshold kingdom between the mapped and the unmapped. That in-between quality is one reason the setting feels both concrete and dreamlike. Concrete, because the pillars are real. The Atlantic swells are real. The idea of islands beyond the straits is grounded in sailor gossip and Phoenician voyages along the western coasts. Dreamlike, because as soon as you pass those straits, the specifics dissolve. Distances blur, directions lose their precision. You are in the zone where myth, hearsay, and slow inference from tides and winds overlap. It is exactly the kind of space where you can place a teeming superpower that rose and fell without leaving obvious traces in the world your audience knows. To Plato's contemporaries, this blend would not necessarily invite literal cartographic reading. Many of them were used to stories that slide between real promontories and symbolic islands. The outer ocean was a legitimate topic for speculation. An island empire out there could be understood as a dramatized stand-in for Western enemies, for the dangers of naval power, for hubris that grows far from home. Later readers, especially once geographical knowledge expanded, began to treat Plato's sketch more as a puzzle to solve. If he says beyond the pillars, then surely we must look beyond Gibraltar. If he says an island larger than Libya and Asia, then we must hunt for a missing continent. If he mentions stepping stone islands, then perhaps he is encoding a specific route. The more literal the reading, the more pressure on the map. Whole theories have grown up around matching each phrase to a modern feature. A bank, a plateau, a submerged ridge. But that impulse to freeze Plato's flexible, symbolic seascape into a fixed coordinate grid is not how his audience would have heard the story. For them, the geography was convincing enough to carry the narrative, but open enough to do philosophical work. It pointed outward to the edge of the Greek world, and then one step farther into the moral ocean where cities rise in power, overreach, and are swept away. From that floating platform, Plato is ready to zoom in, to take you down from oceanic scale to street level and describe a city whose every ring, canal and avenue seems arranged according to a plan. Atlantis, as Plato gives it to us, is not a blur on the horizon. When he finally zooms in, the vagueness of outer geography snaps into sharp focus. The island's capital is described with the kind of precision that feels less like travel notes and more like an architect laying out a plan on wax tablets. At the centre is a low hill, sacred, where the first Atlantean king, a son of Poseidon, is said to have lived. Around that hill, the god himself reshapes the land. He cuts 3 concentric rings of water and 2 of land, alternating bands encircling the central acropolis like ripples frozen in stone. Bridges cross the rings, laid out so that a straight line can run from the outer plain all the way to the temple of Poseidon in the middle. Canals connect the water rings to the sea. The whole thing is measured in stadia, with widths, depths and distances, spelled out in a way that invites you to picture section drawings and city grids. This is not how most ancient myths talk about cities. Older epic poetry might praise broad-streeted or well-walled places, but it rarely pauses to explain how wide the streets are, how the walls curve, how the harbour is dredged and channelled. Plato does. He lists the great circular harbour basins, the huge central canal running straight to the outer sea, the docks, ship sheds and causeways. He tells you how wide the central island is, how tall its surrounding walls are, where the guard posts sit. It is the language of a blueprint. Many readers have noticed that this looks less like a remembered city and more like an idealized diagram, the kind a philosopher might sketch if you asked him to imagine a powerful maritime state engineered from scratch. The architecture in the story behaves like political philosophy made visible. Concentric rings of land and water naturally enforce hierarchy. The innermost island holds the royal palace and the chief temple of Poseidon. Only the higher status group can live there. The next ring is for guardians and officials. The outer zones handle traffic, trade, and the bustle of port life. Movement is channeled, power is literally central. The layout turns social order into geometry. Even the famous Great Plain beyond the city is laid out in straight lines. It is described as a perfect rectangle, irrigated by a grid of canals, subdivided into regular lots. The 10 kings of Atlantis are said to rule 10 districts, each with its assigned portion of land and its obligations of tribute and defence. To someone who spends his career thinking about order in the soul and order in the city, this kind of design is not accidental. The wealth of Atlantis is expressed with the same stylized exactness. We are told of a land overflowing with metals, gold, silver, copper, tin, and, in a detail that has fascinated readers for centuries, a mysterious substance called orichalcum. In the dialogue, this is said to be second in value only to gold and found in many parts of the island. Ancient commentators were not entirely sure what orichalcum was. Some imagined a naturally occurring alloy, perhaps a bright copper zinc or copper tin metal. Others treated it more like a legendary material, a symbol of exotic abundance. Plato leans into the mystique. He has the Atlanteans plate their outer walls in bronze, the next wall in tin, and the innermost in glowing orichalcum. They cover the temple of Poseidon with silver on the outside and gold within. The floor, the pillars, the roof beams glitter with precious metals and ivory inlays. This is architecture as display. It is meant to dazzle, but also to say something about the society, that it has mastered resources, marshalled labour, and concentrated riches at the centre. The city is not just functional, it is theatrical. Religion in this world is part of the staging. The central temple to Poseidon and the mortal woman he loved stands at the heart of the rings. It is here that the 10 kings gather every few years for solemn rituals. They come to renew their oaths, to judge disputes, to sacrifice a bull to their divine ancestor. The ceremony is described in oddly concrete detail. The kings catch the bull within the precinct, lead it to the pillar where the laws are inscribed, pour its blood over the stone, and then, by firelight, read and swear to those laws. It is a picture of religion as the glue that holds the constitution together. The gods, or at least their symbols, legitimize the order of the city. Law is not merely a human agreement. It is carved on a divine pillar in a sacred court, renewed with sacrifice, accompanied by wine and solemn invocations. To obey is to keep faith not only with your fellow kings, but with Poseidon himself. This fits uncannily well with Greek reflections on how cities actually function. In other dialogues, Plato worries about constitutions decaying, about how wealth and luxury soften character, how religious festivals can either reinforce good order or mask corruption. In the Atlantis story, we see a version of the before picture. At first, the 10 kings are said to honour the laws, to despise luxury, to value virtue over gold. The rings, the canals, the glittering metals all exist, but their rulers remain self-controlled. Their wealth is ordered, their power is restrained by oaths. This is the high point, the fragile moment of balance before decline. And the details Plato selects are not neutral. The lavish metals, the enormous navy, the elaborate feasts and sacrifices all echo live debates in classical Greece about the dangers of maritime empires like Athens, about Persian-style opulence, about whether a city surrounded by luxury can still produce courageous, disciplined citizens. Later in the dialogue, when the Atlanteans begin to change, the symbolism tightens. Their divine ancestry is said to become diluted by too much mortal blood. They start to prize wealth over virtue, expansion over justice. The shining city that once embodied perfect order becomes an example of what happens when outer splendour is not matched by inner restraint. For many modern scholars, this too perfect starting point is part of the reason they see Atlantis as allegory. The geometry is exact. The constitutional machinery is neat. The moral arc from order to corruption follows the lines of Plato's other work. It feels like a constructed case study rather than a messy, remembered city with inconvenient irregularities. Real cities grow by accidents, rebuild after fires, adapt to topography, compromise with neighbours. Their streets kink and weave, their ports are cramped, their laws are patched. Atlantis, by contrast, looks as if it were drawn with a compass and square, its institutions tuned to illustrate a thesis about virtue and decay. That does not settle the question of whether there were dim memories of real places folded into the tale, but it does explain why the city as presented has such an uncanny, dreamlike precision. It is a place that seems designed not only by engineers, but by a moralist. And in the mirror of that design, Plato is preparing to show you something closer to home. A very different city, with a very different kind of greatness, standing across the sea as Atlantis's opposite number. Plato does something curious with that other city. He does not simply say, "Meanwhile, in Athens." He picks up the whole story and drops it into an age so remote that, if it were history, almost nothing Greek should look familiar. The Athens that faces Atlantis in his tale is not the bustling democracy of Pericles, with juries, drama festivals, and noisy assemblies. It is placed thousands of years earlier, in a mythical heroic age, when the Acropolis is still a simple hill and the land around it is more forest than street. And yet, when he describes this primeval Athens, it sounds suspiciously like the kind of city he wants to see in his own time. Its citizens are few but disciplined. They live modestly without soft couches and elaborate dishes. They farm and train and keep their bodies hardened. They are said to have a constitution drawn up along ideal lines, with each class doing its own work and not meddling in the business of the others. In other words, they look a lot less like historical Bronze Age villages and a lot more like an embodied chapter from the Republic. Plato has taken the blueprint of a just city he argued for in that dialogue, stripped away some of the explicit theory, and pushed it back into deep time as if it had once really existed. These Athenians are ruled by guardians who love wisdom more than money, who live in common, who are ready for war but not eager to conquer. Their land in the story is not rich in gold or strange metals. It is fertile enough, but nothing extravagant. Their strength is not measured in glittering walls or canal networks, but in the character of their people. The contrast with Atlantis is intentional and sharp. Where Atlantis is expansive, this Athens is self-contained. Where Atlantis lays out vast plains in rectangles and imposes tribute on distant peoples, Athens tends its own territory and fights only when threatened. Where Atlantis glows with orichalcum and silver, Athens is almost austere, a city in plain clothing. This is not because Plato had documentary evidence that some earlier Athens really looked this way. There is no archaeological trace of a mighty Athenian empire in the 10th millennium BCE. The chronology in the story is frankly impossible if taken as literal civic history, but as moral fiction, the timing is perfect. By setting his ideal Athens far back, he can say, in effect, the soul of this city is older than its current institutions. The best version of Athens is not the imperial power that just lost a ruinous war to Sparta. It is a quieter, stricter, more virtuous community that once long ago stood alone against a seductive, overreaching empire and won. The war narrative that follows is simple in outline. The Atlanteans, swollen with wealth and ambition, begin extending their control over vast regions. They subdue parts of Libya and Europe. They are pushing ever closer to Greece. Most of the peoples they encounter fall or submit. Only one small city-state stands firm. The primeval Athenians resist. They rally their allies. They face the vast invading force, and in the story they defeat the Atlantean Empire and free those who had been enslaved. Then catastrophe wipes the board clean. Earthquakes, floods, and the sinking of Atlantis erase almost all material evidence of the war, and also, conveniently, why no one in Plato's own time can point to monuments from that age in Athens. Inside the logic of the dialogue, this is not an incidental battle scene. It proves something. It shows in narrative form the claim Plato makes in the Republic, that a just city, even if smaller and less wealthy, is stronger in the long run than an unjust one. That discipline and moderation outweigh luxury and size when real danger arrives. Atlantis is the case study of what happens when a good constitution decays into love of wealth and power. Athens is the demonstration that a city devoted to virtue can not only resist that temptation, but also stand as a bulwark for others. This lets Plato revisit themes from his earlier work without simply repeating himself. Instead of Socrates drawing concentric diagrams of souls and classes on the ground, we get concentric rings of sea and land. Instead of a long argument about why guardians should live simply, we get a quiet picture of Athenians who already do. Instead of abstract charts comparing constitutions, we watch two city types collide, one ordered, one decadent. He is turning theory into story. There is a reason this pattern feels familiar, even if you have never read Plato. Many cultures carry tales in which a simple, virtuous community confronts a more opulent, morally compromised power. Hebrew prophets contrast a faithful remnant with decadent empires like Babylon. Roman writers later praise the stern, agrarian republic against the luxury of the late empire. Modern stories still retell the same shape: frontier towns against corrupt metropolises, small rebel groups against gleaming authoritarian centres. These stories persist because they crystallize a recurring anxiety. Wealth brings comfort, and comfort threatens to dissolve the hardness needed for survival. Expansion promises security, but it also invites hubris. People watch their own societies grow richer and more complex and wonder, are we becoming Atlantis? Plato is tapping that anxiety deliberately. By making Atlantis so dazzling, he makes its fall satisfying and cautionary. By making ancient Athens so restrained, he makes its victory feel like a vindication of his philosophical city without having to lecture. What does this suggest about his purpose? It points away from the idea that he was preserving a precise historical record of a lost island, and toward the idea that he was crafting a moral mirror. On one side, he holds up Atlantis, a carefully constructed image of ordered power sliding into greed. On the other, he holds up a stylized Athens, a city that has for a moment gotten everything right, and shows what justice looks like in action. Between them, he invites his audience, citizens of a wounded post-war Athens, to reflect. Which city are we more like now? Which future are we drifting toward? If an empire across the sea were to rise again, would we have the character to face it? And hanging over all of it, he adds one more question, the one that keeps Atlantis resurfacing in imaginations long after his specific argument has faded. What if the end of such cities does not come slowly but all at once in water and fire? In Plato's telling, the answer comes with terrifying speed. Not in a long decline, not in a measured fall from power across centuries, but in a single blow. He says that after Atlantis had been defeated by that primeval Athens, and after its ambition had overreached, the gods sent punishment. Not a minor correction. Not a bad harvest or an inconvenient revolt. Violent earthquakes and floods, he writes, struck in a single day and night of misfortune. The great island empire, with its rings of harbour and wall, its temples flashing with metal, its canals and bridges, is swallowed. The earth opens, the sea pours in. In that one day and one night, Atlantis disappeared into the depths of the sea. The story does not linger on screaming or chaos. It moves past the destruction with a kind of calm finality. The land that was once the island, we are told, becomes a shoal of mud, blocking travel and making the sea there impassable and muddy. For a Greek listener, this was not just theatrical. The eastern Mediterranean is a restless place. The earth there does not sit still. Athenians had seen what earthquakes could do. They knew of whole towns shaken to the ground. They lived within cultural memory of eruptions and sea waves that could erase coastal settlements between one generation and the next. The great sanctuary at Delphi had legends of the earth opening, swallowing people whole. The island of Thera, in the Bronze Age, had exploded with such violence that later Greeks walked its broken caldera without really understanding what they were seeing. Even if Plato himself did not know the details of that eruption, he lived in a world where people heard of sudden inundations, harbours ruined, coasts reshaped by storms and quakes. The idea that land could sink and sea could rise was not science fiction to them. It was part of the way the world behaved, so when he says in a single day and night his audience could nod. They had seen lesser versions. All he did was take that familiar violence and scale it up until it fit an entire island power. Notice also how he frames the timing. He does not say, "Last year this happened." He does not even say, "In the age of our grandfathers." He places it in a time that is already mythic, thousands upon thousands of years before any temple or chronicle the Greeks possessed. Ancient storytellers often divided time into ages. You see this in Hesiod, who speaks of a golden age, then silver, then bronze, then a race of heroes, then the present Iron Age. You see it in Near Eastern texts where floods and fires mark boundaries between eras. Mythic time is not measured with calendars. It is measured with moods. An age begins when the world has a certain kind of order and ends when that order breaks. Floods in these stories are not just big weather events. They are erasers. They wipe the slate clean so that a new pattern of life can emerge. Plato slots Atlantis into this narrative habit. The war with primeval Athens, the moral decay of Atlantis, the final judgment from the gods, and the sinking of the island all belong to an earlier age, one that ended so thoroughly that only faint, half-remembered stories filtered down to Solon, and from Solon to Critias, and from Critias to Socrates. That muddy, impassable sea detail helps bridge mythic time and ordinary experience. To us it sounds like a flourish. To a sailor of Plato's era, it pointed towards something more tangible. After earthquakes and submarine landslides, coastal waters can become clogged with sediment. Shoals of disturbed silt can make navigation difficult. Rivers, when they change course, can dump mud into bays, turning once clear harbours into shallow, treacherous inlets. There are places near river mouths and deltas where ancient mariners did in fact complain that the sea was silty and hard to cross. A catastrophic landslide off a continental shelf can also create a broad zone of disturbed seabed and turbid water. Plato is likely not giving a precise geological report. He is using a plausible-seeming description rooted in real Mediterranean experience to tag the site of Atlantis as somewhere out beyond the Strait of Gibraltar, where the sea, he claims, had become choked with shoals. Whether or not any particular shoal inspired this line, it does an important job inside the story. It says, "This flood is not pure fantasy. It left a mark. It changed a real navigable space in a way that still matters." Within his philosophical frame, the flood is also a moral correction. Atlantis, in the earliest phase of his tale, is a well-ordered kingdom. Its kings honour the laws given by Poseidon. They restrain their greed. They live with a degree of moderation, over time as generations pass, and the divine portion in them is diluted. Plato says they become more human, in the worst sense, more grasping, more ostentatious, more hungry for conquest. The catastrophe arrives as a kind of cosmic audit. The gods, he says, hold a council. They judge Atlantis. Athens, the just city, has already done its part by standing against their expansion. Now the universe itself, through earthquake and sea, strips away the empire's unearned advantages. In this moral geometry, the flood is not random. It is the world seeking balance. You find this pattern all over ancient thought. When order breaks down, when hubris rises too high, something comes to level it. A plague, a war, a famine, a wave. The disaster is read backward as a verdict. Stories told in this way do not just explain ruin. They reassure. If pride can summon a flood, then justice is not powerless. There is, in principle, a structure to things. Upswings and downswings, rises and falls have meaning. But once you tell the story like this, you have also done something else. You have planted a hook in the mind. A city that vanishes suddenly is not like a city that declines slowly and leaves layers of rubble. A sudden ending implies that ruins still exist somewhere, preserved in a moment, sealed away. It invites the thought, If only we could find the place where it went down, we might see everything as it was in that single day and night. A quiet, gradual decay does not spark treasure maps. A catastrophe does. Plato's description of Atlantis disappearing, of the sea being made impassable by mud, and of the loss of almost all records sets up a perfect narrative gap. Enough detail to feel located, enough destruction to explain why nothing is visible. Just enough left over muddy shallows, old tales, to make the absence feel like a puzzle. Then he makes that gap even sharper in a way that has haunted readers ever since. The dialogue Critias, where this whole elaborate story is being unfolded, does not reach a proper ending. It breaks off. We move through the origin of Atlantis, the layout of the island, the moral decline, the beginning of the war, the divine council that will judge them. We are almost at the climax, and then the text simply stops. Whether Plato never finished it or the ending was lost, we do not know. What that means for us is peculiar. We never hear the full speech describing the destruction. We never get Plato's final framing comments, whatever they would have been. We are left with the flood poised above Atlantis in mid-air, like a wave that has not yet crashed. The imagination rushes in to fill the silence. People replay that single day and night in their minds, expand it, picture walls crumbling, ships tossed, lights going out. They wonder what else Critias might have said, the little details, the further hints that would have pinned the island more firmly to some spot on the map. An unfinished story is a powerful engine. It keeps whirring long after the written words stop. With Atlantis, that incompleteness fuses with the drama of the flood itself. A city that ends an age, a punishment that comes all at once, a sea made muddy, a page that goes blank where an ending should be. It is no wonder that later ages, waking and dreaming, began to ask the next question on their own. If Plato left the story mid-sentence, how did those who came after him pick it up? The short answer is, for a long time they mostly didn't. You might imagine the generations after Plato rushing to comment on Atlantis, arguing about its location, poring over maps of the Atlantic. But when you read the surviving literature of classical antiquity, what's striking is the silence. Major historians of the Greek and Roman world, Herodotus, Thucydides, Polybius, Tacitus, do not build their narratives around a sunken island empire. They don't treat it as a crucial lost chapter of human history. Most of them don't mention it at all. This doesn't mean nobody read Plato. They did. He was copied, discussed, argued with, imitated. But people went to him for ethics, for political theory, for the nature of the soul. The dialogues that carried the Atlantis story, Timaeus and Critias, were a small part of a much larger body of work. And within those dialogues, Atlantis itself is only one strand. Ancient readers could have walked away from Timaeus thinking about the structure of the cosmos. They could have put down Critias thinking about models of government or about the way cities rise and fall. The lost island was there, yes, but it was woven into a broader philosophical tapestry. So when you look at the early reception, you don't see a frenzy of debate about whether Atlantis really sank. You see something more muted and more telling. Philosophers and commentators, especially those in Plato's own tradition, tended to treat the story as a kind of fable with teeth, a myth used for teaching. For them, myth did not mean silly made-up nonsense. In Greek, the word mythos simply meant a story, a narrative. It could be true, partly true, or not true at all. Its value lay less in its literal details and more in the pattern it revealed. A myth could be a vehicle for moral reflection, a way of talking about the soul, about justice, about the shape of time. When Plato himself tells myths, the cave, the chariot of the soul, the tale of he does not always ask you to accept them as historical reports. He asks you to see what they point toward. Many ancient intellectuals read Atlantis the same way. They saw in it a warning about hubris, about luxury that corrodes character, about the fragility of empires that forget the virtues that made them strong. They saw a contrast between a disciplined, almost austere Athens and a splendid, decadent Atlantis. That contrast, not the exact coordinates of the island, was what mattered. Some later writers, in that spirit, would simply borrow the pattern without the name. They would speak of proud cities laid low by the gods, of floods that erase unjust ages, of lands swallowed for their sins, without ever saying Atlantis. The myth had been absorbed into a larger repertoire of moral examples. But not everyone was content to leave it there. Already in antiquity there were sceptical voices who looked at the Atlantis story and raised an eyebrow. They had questions, sharp ones, the timescale for instance. Plato speaks of 9,000 years between Solon and the fall of Atlantis, which would push the war back into a foggy prehistory no Greek chronologist accepted. Many scholars of the classical world worked with human timelines that were measured in centuries, not tens of millennia. For them, that number looked exaggerated, symbolic, or simply wrong. They also wondered about the geography. A huge island, larger than Libya and Asia together, sitting just beyond the Strait of Gibraltar, with a highly developed civilization, a powerful navy, and a war against Athens itself, yet leaving no trace in any other Greek source. No mention in Herodotus, who had interviewed Egyptian priests and catalogued marvels from Spain to India. That absence bothered them. Later, some writers would say outright that Plato invented the place. Not as a prank, but as a deliberate noble fiction. A made-up story designed to illuminate real truths about politics and morality. Just as his perfectly just city in the Republic is an ideal type rather than a city you could visit, so his perfectly balanced, then corrupted, maritime empire could be read as a kind of thought experiment. On the other side of the spectrum were the Neoplatonists. Centuries after Plato, in the Roman imperial period, these philosophers put his works at the centre of their worldview. They believed his myths were not random ornaments, but encoded insights into the nature of reality. For them, stories like Atlantis could point to deep metaphysical structures. Some Neoplatonist commentators argued that Plato's tales preserved echoes of cosmic cycles, ages of rising and falling, of creation and destruction, of souls descending into matter and rising back out. Atlantis, to them, was not a single lost island so much as a symbol of a type of world age that had come and gone, perhaps many times. Others tried to harmonize Plato with other traditions. They would note that Egyptians had flood tales, that Near Eastern cultures told of deluges, that Greek poets spoke of earlier races wiped out by disaster. By placing Atlantis in that company, they could elevate it, not just a story Plato happened to make up, but part of an ancient cross-cultural memory of worlds before our own. Something subtle happens in this process. Each time a later writer mentions Atlantis and casually adds, as Plato relates, or as is known from the Egyptians, or as some chronicles attest, they create a little chain of citation. Then someone else, writing still later, looks back and sees multiple references to Plato, to a Neoplatonist commentary, to a doxographer summarizing earlier philosophers, and it starts to feel like independent confirmation. Many voices all pointing toward the same lost island. But when you trace the threads carefully, they lead back to one place, Plato's dialogues. There is no early Egyptian inscription describing Atlantis, no independent Greek epic that names the island, no Bronze Age tablet mapping its harbours. What we have is a story in Timaeus and Critias, and then centuries of readers, each reacting in their own way, echoing and transforming it. Ancient intellectuals were usually clear about this. When they called something a myth, they didn't necessarily mean false. They meant a story whose power lies in what it reveals, not in whether every detail can be verified. Myths could be inspired, insightful, even divinely guided. They could also be obviously fictional. The classification did not lock you into one stance or the other. Within that spectrum, Atlantis occupied a curious middle ground, important enough to be discussed in commentaries on Plato, useful as an example of divine justice or of cyclical catastrophes, intriguing to those who like to weave grand harmonies between Greek philosophy and older Near Eastern lore, but not central enough to reshape historical writing. It did not become the backbone of Greek chronologies. It did not anchor Roman origin myths. It did not dominate debates about the age of the world. For most of antiquity, Atlantis stayed on the margins. A striking story tucked inside a philosophical dialogue, a convenient emblem of rise and fall, a symbol more than a data point. The real transformation would come much later, when new audiences with new anxieties and new ambitions picked up Plato's text and asked very different questions. Not what does this tell us about justice, but where was it? Not what does this say about the soul, but can we find it? To see how that shift happened, we have to follow the story through the long, dim centuries after the fall of Rome, into monasteries, scriptoria, and the restless imaginations of the Middle Ages. When the political structures of the Western Roman Empire fell apart, Plato did not vanish with them, but he did become harder to reach. His dialogues survived as fragile, hand-copied manuscripts, a few in the Latin West, more in the Greek-speaking East, in Byzantium. A monk in Italy, a scholar in Constantinople, a scribe in an Egyptian monastery might all be copying the same text, line by line in long quiet rooms lit by oil lamps. In that world, books were not commodities, they were heirlooms. If your monastery owned a copy of the Timaeus, that was a treasure. If it had Critias as well, that was rarer still, and even then, the people who could read Greek fluently enough to wrestle with Plato's arguments were few. So Atlantis, as a story, spent centuries moving at a walking pace. It travelled in glosses written in the margins of manuscripts, in Latin summaries of Greek thought, in encyclopedias that tried to compress all ancient knowledge into a few dense volumes. Sometimes the name Atlantis dropped out entirely, and all that remained was a brief note about a proud island that angered the gods and sank. In the Christian Middle Ages, the story was usually filtered through a different set of questions. The big issues were not where was this island, but how old is the world, and how do Greek philosophers fit into a biblical timeline? Many thinkers treated pagan myths as garbled memories of the flood or of earlier divine judgments. A sunken civilization could be folded easily into that framework. One more example of human pride punished by catastrophe. Other writers, especially in the Latin West, where access to the full Platonic corpus was patchy, barely noticed Atlantis at all. They knew Plato mainly through a handful of texts and through the lens of Augustine, who quoted him when useful and argued against him when necessary. If you had asked a typical educated Christian in the 12th century about Atlantis, they might have stared at you blankly. If they knew the word at all, it would likely have been as a curious detail in some commentary on the Timaeus, not as a living, urgent mystery. And yet the manuscript chains kept going, through Byzantium, where Greek remained a living scholarly language, through Arabic translators who preserved and commented on Greek science and philosophy, through occasional contacts between East and West, diplomatic missions, exiled scholars, traders carrying books along with spices and silk. That slow, uneven transmission is what made the next phase possible. In the 14th and 15th centuries, something changed in Western Europe. The movement we now call Renaissance humanism was, among other things, a reading revolution. Humanists wanted to go back to the sources, ad fontes, not summaries of Plato, but Plato himself, not Christianized paraphrases of Greek ideas, but the original Greek words. Suddenly, Greek was fashionable again in Italy. Teachers from Byzantium were invited to Florence. Young scholars pored over unfamiliar letters, sounding out syllables, copying, translating. Among the texts they recovered, edited and circulated were the Timaeus and Critias. When those dialogues were printed for the first time, the effect was subtle but profound. The printing press took what had been scarce and made it reproducible. A work that might once have existed in a handful of manuscripts could now be produced in dozens, then hundreds of identical copies. Translation amplified that effect. Latin versions of Plato reached people who could not read Greek. Vernacular translations, in time, reached people who could not read Latin well. Suddenly, the circle of those who could encounter the Atlantis story directly, rather than in passing allusions, widened. At the same time, European maps were being redrawn. Portuguese and Spanish ships were pushing down the coast of Africa west into the Atlantic, then across to what they called the New World. Islands and coastlines that had been blank spaces on medieval Mappe Mundi were now acquiring names, contours, and coordinates. The phrase "beyond the Pillars of Heracles," which for Plato had marked the edge of the familiar world, no longer pointed into pure imagination. It pointed into waters that were now crowded with caravels. When readers in this age turned to Plato and saw mention of a great island beyond that strait, their minds did something almost automatic. They mapped beyond onto the new geography they were hearing about in travel accounts and port gossip. A vast ocean, unknown coasts, strange peoples, lost lands. The distance between a philosophical myth and a possible physical place narrowed. Humanists debated how literally to take all this. Some, shaped by medieval traditions, still treated Atlantis as an allegory, a moral or political fable about virtue, decadence, and divine justice. For them, the disappearance of the island was a symbol of how entire orders of the world can pass away. Others, influenced by a new appetite for empirical history, began to ask whether Plato might be preserving a distorted memory of some actual event, a flood, an earthquake, the destruction of a coastal culture now forgotten. Most were somewhere in between. They might say, yes, the tale is wrapped in allegory. Yes, Plato may have adjusted numbers and details for philosophical effect, but underneath, perhaps, there could be a core of truth, a real island, a real catastrophe, a war between early peoples that left faint traces in later traditions. The timing of these questions mattered. It is easier to imagine a lost continent when your maps are full of emptiness. As European sailors realized how big the world's oceans truly were, the idea of a submerged landmass no longer seemed completely absurd. If there were entire continents across the sea that no European had known about for millennia, why not one more, now sunken? Atlantis became a flexible symbol in this climate. For some Renaissance thinkers, it stood for a golden age of lost wisdom, an ancient scientific or spiritual knowledge that had vanished beneath the waves, waiting to be recovered. For others, it was a cautionary emblem of how even the mightiest civilizations could crumble. And for a growing number, it became something tantalizingly in between myth and geography. A maybe place. Printing and translation ensured that these debates did not stay confined to a few scholars in Florence or Paris. Pamphlets, treatises, marginal notes in printed editions of Plato all circulated through the new republic of letters. Educated readers from Lisbon to London could now form their own opinions. By the time European exploration had linked the Atlantic, the Indian, and, eventually, the Pacific into a single navigable world ocean, the mental category of lost lands had shifted. Once, Atlantis had floated at the edge of a flat, symbolic map, a philosophical elsewhere beyond the known. Now the edge kept moving, and with every voyage it became a little more plausible to think, if islands can be discovered, they can also disappear. In that sense, global exploration did something paradoxical. It reduced the unknown, but it also gave the unknown a more concrete shape. The more precisely people could chart what existed, the more room they felt to imagine what might once have existed in some unrecorded past. Into that widening space between evidence and imagination, the legend of Atlantis began to expand. No longer just a story tucked into a difficult dialogue, no longer just a moral example in a commentary. It was becoming a question. If Plato's island had been real, where would it fit on these new maps? Which coastlines, which ruins, which oral traditions might carry its echo? Those questions would drive the next chapter, an age of speculation in which scholars, mystics and adventurers all tried, in very different ways, to claim Atlantis as their own. By the 19th century, that question had seeped out of learned Latin and into the wider public. The old, slow chain of manuscripts had become printed books, magazines, lecture halls, parlours. Atlantis was no longer just a curious detail in Plato. It was a problem you could argue about over dinner. The timing was not an accident. In Europe and North America, the 19th century was an age of enormous confidence and enormous anxiety. Railways, telegraphs, steamships, factories, new machines were collapsing distances and reordering time. Scholars were piecing together deep geological ages and human prehistory. Darwin was about to publish on the origin of species. The biblical 6,000 years were quietly giving way to millions. People were learning that the world was older than they'd been told, and that countless human stories had played out before anyone had written a line of history. Into that widening gap between known history and deep time, Atlantis slipped very neatly. If Plato's island really had existed 9,000 years before Solon, that placed it far beyond the comfort zone of classical chronicles, but not beyond the imaginative reach of new geology and archaeology. Long enough ago to be mysterious, recent enough to feel human. So in this climate, a certain kind of thinker began to treat Atlantis not as allegory, not as maybe place, but as missing chapter. A real civilization with real cities, ships, laws, sciences. The mother of all later cultures, the most influential of these, was an American politician, an amateur scholar named Ignatius Donnelly. In 1882, Donnelly published a book with a title that summarized his ambition: Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. In his view, Atlantis was not just a lost island, it was the cradle of civilization before the flood, wiped out by catastrophe, its survivors scattering around the world. Donnelly was a diffusionist. He started from the observation that many ancient societies seemed to share broad similarities: pyramids in Egypt and Mesoamerica, flood myths on multiple continents, sun worship, serpent symbols, step temples, monumental stonework. Where mainstream scholars were beginning to think in terms of independent invention, different peoples facing similar problems, sometimes reinventing similar solutions, Donnelly argued for a single source. Atlantis, in his scheme, was that source. He pictured its people as technologically advanced mariners sending out colonies in all directions, to the Nile Valley, to the coasts of Western Europe, to the shores of the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. Greek myths, Egyptian religion, Central American calendars, even bits of Irish legend were all in his hands, fragments of one shattered mirror. What made the book powerful was not just its thesis, but its tone. Donnelly wrote with the cadence of a lawyer making a case to a jury. He assembled maps, quotations, etymologies, speculative reconstructions. He marshalled geology, linguistics, mythography, even early archaeology, weaving them into a grand, sweeping narrative. For a public just getting used to ancient civilizations being dug up in Mesopotamia and the Andes, this was intoxicating. If Nineveh could emerge from mounds of earth, who was to say that a greater city might not lie beneath the Atlantic? Catastrophism made the idea feel scientifically respectable. 19th century geology had already entertained the notion of sudden, violent changes, earthquakes, floods, volcanic eruptions reshaping the landscape. Donnelly leaned into that. Plato's submerged island became, in his hands, the victim of a global cataclysm, remembered dimly in the biblical flood, in Mesopotamian epics, in legends from India to the Americas. There was comfort in a strange way in this kind of story. If all cultures shared a single origin, then the diversity that industrial empires were encountering could be folded back into a single human family tree. If civilization had risen high once before and fallen in a night, then the breakneck changes of the 19th century were not entirely unprecedented. They were the second act of a very old drama, but there was a problem at the heart of Donnelly's method, and of many theories that followed him. To build his case, he had to cherry-pick. He focused on resemblances that fit his pattern, and brushed aside differences that did not. A step pyramid here, a stepped platform there, a flood myth here, another one there. A word that sounded vaguely similar in two languages, that had no demonstrated historical relationship. If two myths both mentioned serpents, he treated them as echoes of one serpent cult. If two cultures both aligned structures to the solstices, he treated that as proof of shared origin, rather than as something people might independently discover if they watched the sun long enough. The danger of this approach is that the human brain is very good at finding patterns, even when nothing connects them. Given thousands of myths, rituals, and runes to choose from, you can always pluck out a handful that seem to fit your preferred story. Meanwhile, archaeology was changing. In Donnelly's day, excavation was often more treasure hunt than science. But as the 19th century shaded into the 20th, methods stiffened. Stratigraphy, radiocarbon dating, comparative typology, careful recording of context, all of these began to impose discipline. Instead of asking, "What does this ruin remind me of?" archaeologists increasingly asked, "What can we say about this site based on its layers, its materials, its neighbours, its dates?" Atlantis did not fare well under those stricter rules. There was no consistent layer of shared Atlantean artifacts on multiple continents. No ancient inscriptions describing a single lost homeland that matched Plato's account in detail. The similarities Donnelly had pointed to could be better explained by convergent development, independent societies solving similar problems with the tools at hand. But by then, the popular image of Atlantis as a global mother civilization had taken root. Donnelly's book sold widely. It influenced theosophical writings, occult traditions, early science fiction, even fringe racial theories. Later authors added their own layers: psychic revelations, crystal technologies, space visitors, underwater ruins glimpsed in dreams. Pseudo-scientific claims began to orbit the word Atlantis almost automatically. The island became a catch-all explanation for any unsolved mystery. Odd stonework, out-of-place artifacts, gaps in the record, inconvenient evidence. If mainstream scholarship did not yet have an answer, Atlantis could be summoned as a placeholder. It is easy, from a modern perspective, to dismiss all of this with a shrug, to laugh at the wilder theories, to treat Atlantis as shorthand for crackpot. But it is more useful and kinder to ourselves to see it as a case study in how humans handle the unknown. When evidence is partial and the desire for meaning is strong, sweeping stories are tempting. They offer a sense of completeness. They make scattered data points feel like parts of a grand design. So how do we navigate this without either embracing every claim or mocking everything that falls outside the current consensus? One quiet approach is to adopt a simple framework. Whenever you encounter a bold Atlantis theory, ancient astronauts, forgotten super-science global empires, ask 3 questions. First, what is the strongest, independently verifiable evidence? Not associations, not "this looks like that," but things you can date, measure, and test. Second, how does this explanation compare to simpler ones? If 2 cultures both build pyramids, is a lost super-civilization required, or can geometry, gravity, and the desire to pile stones up toward the sky account for it? Third, does the claim make risky predictions that could be wrong? A good hypothesis sticks its neck out. It says, if this is true, we should find X in this layer, in this region, from this time period. Then you can check. Using those questions does not mean closing the door on wonder. It means keeping wonder and curiosity anchored to the ground, where new discoveries can actually change your mind. In that space between skepticism and open-mouthed belief, the story of Atlantis becomes more interesting, not less. It shifts from being a ready-made answer to being a lens on how we build answers at all. And with that lens in hand, we can turn back from Donnelly's global Atlantis to something narrower, but far better supported by evidence. Real Bronze Age cultures that lived on real islands, built real palaces, and endured real catastrophes, including one in the Aegean, where ash and broken walls still tell the story of a day when fire and sea remade the world. If you sail southeast from mainland Greece, across that broken scatter of islands, you reach Crete. Long before Plato, long before classical Athens, this was the seat of one of the Mediterranean's first great sea powers. We call them the Minoans. They did not leave us long historical texts like the Egyptians or the Mesopotamians. Their main script, Linear A, is still undeciphered. But they left something just as eloquent: their cities. On Crete, archaeologists have uncovered sprawling palace complexes at places like Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, and Kato-Zakros. These were not crude fortresses. They were intricate labyrinths of rooms and corridors, storerooms and workshops, paved courtyards and staircases, walls painted with vivid frescoes, leaping dolphins, lilies, spirals of waves, women in flounced skirts, bull leapers vaulting over charging animals. Everywhere you see the same themes: the sea, movement, abundance. Minoan harbours open toward every point of the compass. Their pottery has been found as far away as Egypt and the Levant. Their craftsmen worked gold, ivory, semi-precious stones. Their merchants moved copper and tin, the raw ingredients of bronze, across the water. Crete, sitting in the middle of the eastern Mediterranean, was perfectly placed to become a maritime crossroads, and it did. To a later Greek imagination, looking back from the age of city-states and hoplite warfare, this earlier world could feel almost mythical. A thalassocracy, as the ancient historians called it, a power of the sea, rich, refined, and for a time apparently secure. Then, in the middle of the second millennium BCE, something happened to their northern neighbour. On the circle of islands we now call Santorini, and the ancients called Thera, a city grew on the inner slopes of a volcano. Minoan-style houses, paved streets, elaborate drainage systems, wall paintings in the Cretan style. Another node in that maritime network. Underneath it, pressure was building. The Thera eruption is one of the largest volcanic events in human history. The exact year is still debated. Radiocarbon dates, tree rings, and Egyptian chronologies do not line up perfectly, but most scholars place it somewhere around the 1600s BCE. When it went, it did not go quietly. First came earthquakes, then explosions that tore the heart out of the island, sending columns of ash high into the atmosphere. Pumice and ash rained onto nearby lands. The central part of Thera collapsed into the sea, creating the caldera we see today. The energy released was many times that of Krakatoa. Most devastating for the Minoans were the tsunamis. Waves raced outward across the Aegean, slamming into the north coast of Crete. Harbours, ships, coastal settlements, everything low-lying along those shores would have been hammered. Even sites farther inland felt the ash and the atmospheric effects. Agriculture, already delicately balanced on Mediterranean rainfall, would have suffered from years of disrupted seasons. It was not an instant, total annihilation. Crete did not sink. Many inland palaces continued to function for some time after. But the shock was enormous, and the wider region felt it. Here is where minds begin to drift toward Plato, a prosperous island culture that lives by the sea. A sudden catastrophe linked to earthquakes and flooding. A civilization that not long afterward weakens and is eventually overtaken by others. The temptation to draw a line from Minoan Crete and Thera straight to Atlantis is strong. You can see why this became the most popular real-world candidate once serious archaeology got underway in the Aegean. For the first time, people had an actual Bronze Age maritime culture, obliterated harbours, ash layers, tsunami deposits, a natural catastrophe, not just on paper, but in the rocks. There are undeniably parallels. Minoan power seems to crest and falter in the centuries after the eruption. Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland appear in the record, taking over sites, adopting and adapting Minoan styles. Trade networks reorganize. What had been a Cretan-centered world becomes something else. A great sea power, humbled by disaster and invasion, half-remembered centuries later as a once mighty island kingdom destroyed in a night. It is an evocative picture, but the fit is not exact. Plato puts Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Heracles, by which Greeks of his time almost always meant the Strait of Gibraltar, the neck between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. Crete and Thera lie well inside those pillars, deep in the Aegean in thoroughly familiar waters. His Atlantean plain is described as a vast flat expanse, ringed by mountains, with a series of circular harbours and artificial canals laid out on an almost geometric plan. Minoan sites, as we actually find them, are irregular, adapted to hillsides and local topography, clustered around natural harbours without the concentric ring layout. There is also the matter of time. Plato, citing the Egyptian priests, places Atlantis 9,000 years before Solon, around 9,600 BCE. The Minoan peak and the Thera eruption are in the 1600s-1400s BCE. Even allowing for damaged numbers in transmission, or for the Greek habit of turning hundreds into thousands for grandeur, you still have a gap of a millennium or more between Plato's claimed era and the Bronze Age Aegean events. And Plato's moral framing Atlantis as an arrogant imperial power punished for its hubris in a single day and night does not map cleanly onto the slow, messy process of Minoan decline, tsunami damage, economic stress, possible internal unrest, and then Mycenaean takeover. So mainstream scholars tend to draw a careful line. Yes, they say, Minoan Crete and the Thera eruption show that the Greek world preserved real memories of real catastrophes. Yes, the idea of a rich island culture destroyed by earthquakes and floods would have been entirely plausible to Plato's audience, because something like it had in fact happened in their deeper past. Stories of that disaster could have worked their way through generations of myth and local legend. Sea gods angry, islands exploding, cities drowned. But no, the Minoans are not Atlantis in any straightforward, one-to-one sense. The geography is wrong, the dates are off, the details diverge. At most, Minoan Crete and Thera might have provided raw material, emotional colour, narrative elements, that Plato reworked for his own philosophical purposes. In that sense, this remains the most discussed naturalistic candidate, not because it neatly solves the riddle, but because it shows how the riddle might have been invented in the first place. Take a real disaster, let it echo through oral tradition. Allow centuries of retelling to blur coastlines, stretch timelines, rearrange motives. By the time a philosopher in 4th century BCE Athens picks up the story, he is no longer dealing with a chronicle. He is holding a mythic shape, flexible enough to be moulded into a parable about virtue and decay. And yet, down beneath the layers of moralizing and allegory, there may still be a faint imprint of ash and broken harbours on a Cretan shore. If Atlantis is not Minoan Crete, the Minoans at least prove that the world Plato imagined, a sea-spanning culture living under the shadow of sudden ruin, was not entirely a dream. And once you accept that, you begin to look not just east toward the Aegean, but west, toward the broader seas beyond the Pillars, asking whether other islands, other coasts, might have fed into the story as well. When Plato says, beyond the Pillars of Heracles, Most ears in his time would have heard one place, the Strait of Gibraltar, two headlands facing each other across a narrow throat of water. On the European side, the Rock of Gibraltar. On the African side, Jebel Musa and the mountains around Ceuta. For Greek sailors pushing west along the North African coast, this was the edge of the familiar map. Beyond it, the Atlantic, the outer sea, wide, unpredictable, and for a long time rarely crossed. Heracles in myth had torn apart a mountain to make this passage. The pillars were the cliffs left behind. So when Plato situates Atlantis in front of or beyond those pillars, many later readers went straight to Gibraltar and started looking outward. If there was once a powerful maritime culture out there, they reasoned, it ought to have left traces along the coasts close by. And on the Iberian side of that strait, there is a tantalizing name that surfaces in Greek and Roman texts, Tartessos. We do not know exactly where Tartessos was. Most scholars place it somewhere in the lower Guadalquivir Valley, in what is now southwestern Spain, near modern Seville, and the marshes that open toward the Atlantic. Greek writers describe a wealthy kingdom at the far west, rich in silver, copper, and tin. They speak of a river, also called Tartessos, and a king named Argontonios, literally Mr. Silver, by the early 1st millennium BCE. Phoenician traders from the Levant were sailing regularly through Gibraltar, up the Spanish and Portuguese coasts, around to the Atlantic side. They founded colonies and trading posts, Gadir, modern Cadiz, on a small island off the coast. Other, lesser-known sites sprinkled along the shoreline. These people were expert seafarers and copper-bottomed pragmatists. They went where the metals were. In Iberia, they tapped into rich ore deposits and existing local networks. The result was a cluster of coastal centres where local elites and Phoenician merchants mixed, sharing goods, ideas, perhaps religious stories. To a Greek hearing travellers' tales in a port tavern in Athens or Corinth, all of this could blur into a single image, a fabulously rich, far western land beyond the pillars, where rivers shone with metal and kings possessed astonishing wealth. Tartessos, Gadir, unnamed indigenous polities over time, they grow hazy and legendary. That is the solid core, a real region, real trade, real coastal towns whose prosperity depended on exactly the things Plato gives his Atlanteans: metals, seafaring, contact between worlds. Then there is the layer of landscape itself. At the end of the last ice age, sea levels worldwide were far lower than today. As the great ice sheets melted, the oceans rose by more than 100 metres, flooding continental shelves, pushing shorelines inland. The Atlantic coast of Iberia and North Africa was no exception. River valleys widened into estuaries, low-lying plains became bays and marshes. In the last few thousand years, the rise has been much smaller, but shorelines continue to shift. Deltas grow and sink. Barrier islands move. Coastal lagoons silt up. The Guadalquivir Valley in particular has seen large areas transition from dry land to marsh and shallow water. Ancient harbours now lie buried under sediments or tucked behind mudflats. All of this makes for evocative talk of sunken lands, and there are indeed submerged archaeological sites and paleolandscapes on the Atlantic shelf. Prehistoric camps, drowned river channels, former coastlines. But the picture is more modest than some popular accounts suggest. We are mostly dealing with gradual flooding, not whole cities sliding into the ocean in a single night. Fishing villages, perhaps early harbours, low-lying fields and shrines, pieces of human life nibbled away as the sea adjusted to a post-glacial world. Plato also mentions that after Atlantis sank, the sea where it had been became impassable and impenetrable, choked with mud. That line has drawn attention to places where large rivers meet the Atlantic, the Guadalquivir, the Tagus near Lisbon, the great Moroccan and Algerian rivers on the African side. River mouths are messy. They dump sediments into the sea, creating shallow banks, sandbars, turbid water. Ancient sailors without modern charts would have found these zones tricky. Hidden shoals, shifting channels, waters that looked almost solid with suspended silt. It is not hard to imagine a storyteller describing such places as muddy seas, especially if they were tied to memories of earthquakes or coastal subsidence. And earthquakes are very much part of this region's story. The boundary between the African and Eurasian plates runs under the western Mediterranean and the eastern Atlantic. The Iberian and North African coasts have been shaken repeatedly over historical time. The Lisbon earthquake of 1755, centred out in the Atlantic but devastating on land, sent tsunamis across the ocean, flattened parts of Portugal, and was felt as far away as North Africa and the British Isles. Archaeological traces of earlier seismic events appear along these coasts: tilted strata, uplifted shorelines, tsunami deposits in low-lying plains. Some Bronze and Iron Age settlements show signs of abrupt destruction by quake or wave. So in the zone around Gibraltar, we have a real mixture: busy maritime trade and wealthy ports. A half-mythical Western kingdom remembered for its metals. Dynamic, shifting coastlines where lands have drowned and rivers have wandered. Turbid, sediment-heavy waters off major estuaries. And a history of earthquakes and tsunamis capable of terrifying any society that lived through them. This is the raw material that makes the Gibraltar-Iberia region a perennial favourite for those looking for an Atlantis with its feet in actual geography. But then we hit the limits of what the ground will give us. So far, there are no excavated ruins off these coasts that match Plato's detailed description. The great concentric ringed city, the perfectly flat rectangular plain, the monumental canal works laid out to strict dimensions. There are settlements, some substantial, some disrupted by flood or quake, but nothing that steps cleanly out of the text. The stories about Tartessos are late, fragmentary, and already tinged with legend by the time Greek authors record them. The Phoenician presence is clear in material culture, but their own writings from Iberia are sparse. Much of what gets said about lost cities in the marshes or under the Atlantic surf is hypothesis layered on hypothesis, geophysical anomalies, ambiguous structures, speculative identifications. What this region can explain is the plausibility framework. It shows how Greek and later Mediterranean imaginations were, in fact, stocked with images of the far west as a place of metals, harbours, and occasional disaster. It provides realistic sources for ideas about lands beyond the pillars, about muddy, dangerous seas, about coasts shaken and reshaped by earthquakes. What it cannot provide, at least with current evidence, is the specific engineered utopia Plato lays out. The grids of canals, the exact measurements, the moralized rise and fall of a single arrogant empire destroyed all at once. To find that, you have to move away from harbours and marshes, and into the mind of the storyteller himself, into the way a philosopher in 4th century BCE Athens might take scattered reports from the western edge of the world and transform them into a lesson about power, virtue, and ruin. When you step back from all the proposed locations and clever reconstructions, one thing becomes hard to miss. Atlantis behaves less like an archaeological site and more like a moral fable. Plato doesn't just give you a city, he gives you a diagnosis. A society that begins virtuous and disciplined grows rich and powerful, then slowly forgets why it prospered in the first place. The rulers become soft. The citizens fall in love with luxury. The empire turns outward, more tribute, more land, more display. The inner core rots while the outer shell shines brighter than ever. And then, suddenly, it's gone. You can hear the warning built into that arc: hubris, empire and decline. It's the same pattern Greek audiences knew from their own stories: Troy, Thebes, even hints of it in Athens itself after the Persian Wars. It's the pattern Roman writers would later see in their own history. It's the pattern every empire fears but can't quite resist reenacting. So Atlantis keeps coming back because the problem it's talking about keeps coming back. Any time a society worries that it has grown too rich, too powerful, too arrogant, Atlantis becomes relevant again. It's a ready-made parable you can pick up and point at your own age. Swap in your current anxieties, industrial pollution, nuclear weapons, climate change, financial bubbles, and the story still works. But there's another pull at work, operating at a quieter, more psychological level. Atlantis is not just a warning, it's also a lost golden age. A place where technology, art and architecture have reached astonishing heights. Where the metals gleam, the harbours are full, the palaces are perfectly ordered. A civilization that seems to have solved problems we still struggle with. How to manage waterways, organise cities, even coordinate an entire empire. And it's all gone, swallowed by the sea, leaving only rumours and a broken chain of memory. That combination, utopia plus catastrophe, is very powerful. It suggests that somewhere in the deep past, humans knew more than we do now. That knowledge has been lost, not because it was wrong, but because the world is fragile and accidents happen. It implies that history is not a simple climb from primitive to advanced, but a jagged line where brilliant peaks have already come and gone. For anyone who feels out of place in the present, or dissatisfied with how things are organised, this is irresistible. You can imagine Atlantis as a kind of alternate timeline where people built things the right way, where wisdom and power briefly lined up. And if that was once possible, maybe the traces are still out there, waiting to be recovered. That's where the idea of hidden knowledge slips in. Across the centuries, Atlantis has been picked up by people who want to believe there is a secret thread running under history. Renaissance magicians, 19th century spiritualists, 20th century occult societies, New Age writers. They all find in Atlantis a container for the teachings they feel have been suppressed or forgotten. Sometimes it's mystical science. Sometimes it's ancient electricity or crystal technology. Sometimes it's a spiritually enlightened society that fell not because it was wicked, but because the cosmos moved into a darker age. In each case, Atlantis becomes a backstage room of history where special truths were once stored and might be recovered by the right techniques, the right initiation, the right reading of the signs. Modern fiction and film pick up the same themes, rinsed free of dogma and turned into adventure. Atlantis becomes a lost super-city under the ocean, a high-tech civilization that vanished overnight, an alien base, a portal to other dimensions. You see it in children's cartoons, in big-budget movies, in video games. The details change, but the functions remain. Atlantis is the place where the world used to be more marvellous, where the everyday was saturated with wonder, and where something went terribly wrong. It's also the perfect playground for what you might call the search impulse. Humans like maps with blank spots on them. We like the feeling that there are still places the satellites haven't fully named, that the seabed conceals shapes we haven't yet traced. Atlantis, by definition, lives right on that edge. So we get hand-drawn charts with hypothetical islands sketched onto the Atlantic. Sonar sweeps of the ocean floor looking for resemblance to concentric rings. Satellite images of the Sahara or the Caribbean, with every circular depression or rectilinear outline flagged as possible Atlantean remains. Each anomaly becomes a seed for a new theory. The romance isn't really in the evidence. It's in the idea that one day a researcher will overlay the right map, filter the right scan, dive on the right ridge, and a drowned city will suddenly resolve out of background noise. Straight lines under sand, harbour walls on a drowned shelf, streets no eye has seen for 10,000 years. The odds, based on everything we know about sea level rise, tectonics, and ancient engineering, are not kind to that hope. But the act of looking scratches a deep itch. It says there are still discoveries to be made. History is not finished. The world still has secrets. Before we follow that impulse any farther, this is a good moment to mention something more down to earth. If you'd like to drift off with more long stories like this, there's a full book of Sleepy Time History episodes available at sleepytimehistory.com, and there's a discount running this week. It's the same kind of slow, detailed storytelling you're hearing now, just in page form, whenever your eyes feel like doing the listening. Back with Plato, though, the challenge is to separate metaphor from misleading certainty. It's tempting to treat every line of his Atlantis story as a data point, a depth sound, a coordinate, a blueprint that must correspond to a physical place. When we do that, we start bending the world to fit the tale. We ignore the parts of the text that are obviously shaped by his philosophical agenda, and we stretch the archaeology until it snaps. A more cautious reading flips the direction. Instead of asking, "Where is the city that matches this description?" we ask, what was Plato trying to show his readers by building the story this way? Why make Atlantis so geometrically idealized? Why mirror it against a virtuous, besieged Athens? Why have the punishment come not as a human war or revolt, but as an overwhelming act of nature, earthquake and flood, the ground itself turning traitor? Those choices tell us more about Plato's anxieties than about Bronze Age geography. He is talking about what happens when power outruns virtue, when technical capacity outpaces moral discipline, when you can move armies and fleets across the world, but you can't keep greed and vanity under control at home. In that sense, the actual coordinates of Atlantis are almost beside the point. The legend keeps returning because every age finds itself somewhere on that curve, rising, cresting, or feeling the first tremors under its feet. The more closely we listen to Plato, the more the central question shifts. Not where did Atlantis stand, but what was he warning us about? And once you phrase it that way, you start to see why the story refuses to sink. So after all of this, what can we actually say without crossing the line from history into wishful thinking? The first piece is simple, and it's the one everything else hangs from. Atlantis lives inside two dialogues by Plato, the Timaeus and the Critias. That's its home address. There is no older, independent Atlantis archive hiding somewhere in Egyptian temples or Mesopotamian tablets or Bronze Age shipping logs. When later writers talk about Atlantis, they are either repeating Plato, arguing with Plato, or embroidering on Plato. Take him away, and the island disappears. The Egyptian priests in Sais who supposedly told Solon the story, we only meet them in Plato's text, the long chain of transmission, Egyptian temple, Athenian lawgiver, family tradition, philosopher, has no outside paperwork we can check. No inscription in hieroglyphs saying, here is the account of the great island that sank. No parallel narrative in some other Greek historian that doesn't ultimately trace back to him. That doesn't mean Plato invented every atom of it from nothing. It does mean that, for Atlantis, he is both the first and the main witness. When we talk about what Atlantis was, we're really talking about what Plato chose to write. From there, historians and classicists tend to converge on a cautious middle ground. At one extreme, you can read Atlantis as pure allegory, a made-up island, made-up war, made-up catastrophe, assembled with the care of a mathematician arranging a proof, a narrative machine designed to test big ideas about politics, virtue, and cosmic justice. At the other extreme, you can treat every detail as literal, the exact size of the plain, the concentric canals measured in stadia, the precise date 9,000 years before Solon. On that reading, Plato is basically functioning as a reporter, copying down an old historical file with minor philosophical commentary. Most scholars, especially the ones who spend their lives reading Greek texts and working with ancient timelines, drift towards something in between. Plato, in this view, is building a philosophical myth that probably leans on scattered real memories of powerful Bronze Age states, of destructive floods and earthquakes, of rich island cultures in the Eastern Mediterranean, of real conflicts between early Greek cities and maritime powers. Those fragments are rearranged, polished, scaled up, and slotted into a story whose main purpose is not to preserve archival data, but to make a moral and metaphysical point. So how do we decide which claims about Atlantis deserve attention, and which ones are just clever castles in the air? One way is to move through a small mental checklist. First, primary sources. Does this Atlantis theory rest on texts, inscriptions, or artifacts we can actually see and date? Or does it lean heavily on later retellings, channelings, or lost books that only one person seems to know about? The closer you are to documents and objects from the ancient world, the firmer the ground tends to be. Second, archaeology. When someone points to a specific place, Santorini, southern Spain, a Caribbean shelf, what's in the soil? Do we find the right kind of settlements, at the right depth, with the right level of technology? Are there traces of palaces, harbours, walls, writing? Or are we looking at natural formations and hoping they line up? Third, chronology. Plato's 9,000 years doesn't match what we know about Athens, or about complex states with metallurgy, triremes, and grand architecture. If a theory insists on keeping that number literal, it has to answer a hard question. Where is the archaeological footprint of a global-scale Bronze Age superpower around 9600 BCE? If it can't produce one, it has to explain why a more modest adjustment, scribal error, symbolic number, mythic inflation, is less reasonable than filling the Ice Age with skyscrapers. Fourth, falsifiability. A good historical claim should be capable of being wrong. If you say Atlantis was a powerful Bronze Age island culture in the Aegean, and we should find X, Y, and Z types of pottery and architecture if we're right, then a lack of those things counts against you. If instead you say, Atlantis was an advanced psychic civilization whose remains are undetectable by normal means, you've built a theory nothing can touch. It might be consoling. It's not history. Once you start using those filters, most of the louder modern claims about Atlantis slip quietly away. What remains is both smaller and, in its own way, more interesting. We can say that Plato compiled the most influential lost civilization story in Western literature, and that he did it for reasons tied closely to his philosophy of ethics and politics. We can say that he probably drew loosely and selectively on real memories of Minoan Crete and the Thera eruption, of seafaring kingdoms and devastating floods, of the uneasy balance between Greek mainland cities and maritime powers. We can say that later generations kept projecting new hopes and fears onto his island, turning it into a mirror for their own anxieties about empire, about technology, about secret wisdom, about the fragility of progress. We can also say that so far there is no archaeological site anywhere on Earth that clearly matches Plato's full description. The scale, the engineering, the deep antiquity, all together. Pieces resonate here and there, like echoes in a large room, but the room itself has not been found. Beyond that, we're in the realm of maybe and might, and that's where uncertainty becomes less of a frustration and more of a teacher. Because even without a final answer, without a GPS coordinate and a dive plan, the Atlantis story has already shown us several things. It shows us how myths form, grow, and adapt. How a tale crafted in one specific intellectual moment, Athens, in the shadow of war and political turmoil, can escape its original context and live a long second life as a treasure map, a warning label, a spiritual parable, a science fiction backdrop. It shows us how easy it is to mistake our own desires for ancient testimony, to read advanced technology into every vague phrase, to see drowned cities in every sonar blur, to prefer the romance of the secret archive over the plain absence of evidence. And it shows us something gentler too, that part of being human is learning to live with open questions, to investigate as far as our tools will take us, to admit what we don't know, and to let some stories remain partly in shadow without forcing them into shapes that flatter us. So, as you lie there listening, the picture we're left with is quiet and clear. There was a philosopher named Plato, in a very specific city, in a very specific century. He imagined a mighty island power, rising, shining, and falling, to help him think about justice and corruption. He stitched into that invention the distant thunder of real catastrophes and real kingdoms. The world picked up his story, turned it over in its hands for 2,000 years, and layered it with dreams. Maybe something like Atlantis, in some smaller, less symmetrical form, really did stand once. Maybe what survives in Plato is a distorted memory of that place. Or maybe the island never existed outside his mind and the minds that read him. For now, the evidence lets us lean, but not land. The sea keeps its own counsel. The legend keeps its outlines. And you, here at the edge of the map, can let the question rest, knowing that even without a final discovery, the path we followed to reach this point has already told us most of what matters. As the question settles, what's left is less a map and more a gentle pattern. A philosopher in Athens, worrying about justice and power, sketches a shining island that flies too close to the sun. Later readers pick it up and start asking, where was it? How big was it? Could it happen again? And the story, which began as a thought experiment about how societies rise and rot, slowly becomes a canvas for everyone's hopes and fears. Plato's purpose was always surprisingly down to earth. He wanted to talk about pride and restraint, about cities that remember their limits and cities that don't. Atlantis is the cautionary tale. Early Athens, in his telling, is the model of modest strength. The flood is just the final underline, but once that framework escaped into the wider world, the island stopped belonging to him. Medieval writers turned Atlantis into a distant echo of biblical floods and lost Edens. Renaissance scholars tried to fit it into their rediscovered maps, balancing ancient authority against new coastlines. Modern theorists filled it with crystal technology, psychic archives, alien tutors, or secret wisdom schools, depending on what they needed it to be. Each age took the same basic outline and redrew it in its own colours. That's part of why the legend grew so large. It isn't anchored to a single shoreline or a single meaning. It's a shape in the mist that can stand for the fragility of progress, the fear of sudden catastrophe, the dream of hidden knowledge just out of reach. It lets us ask in a safe, distant way, what if everything we've built could vanish? And what if there was once a version of us that did things better? Those are questions that don't go out of date, which is why the island doesn't either. If you've stayed with this story all the way to the edge of sleep, thank you for sailing out this far. Before you drift off, if you've enjoyed this slow journey through Plato's Sea, it really does help if you tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe. It tells the algorithm that you like thoughtful, quiet history, and it lets more sleepy minds find their way here. If you feel awake enough for a sentence or two, I'd love to hear where you're listening from. A city apartment, a farmhouse, a dorm room, a ship's cabin somewhere between coasts. Just a few words in the comments, pinning your own little dot on this loose, invisible map of nighttime listeners. And if this kind of deep, prehistoric unwinding speaks to you, there's more waiting beyond the shoreline. I've put together a book about the older, stranger chapters of our past, bottlenecks and vanished cousins, quiet revolutions in stone and fire. You can find it at sleepytimehistory.com whenever you're curious and awake enough to explore. For now, though, you don't have to remember dates or sift evidence or decide what you believe about a lost island. You can let the whole question fold up like a chart at the end of a voyage. Some stories survive not because every detail is true, but because they speak to something steady in us. Our fear that things break, our hope that they can be rebuilt, our sense that beneath the wreckage there is always some heartbeat of meaning. Atlantis may be myth, memory, or a careful mixture of both. What's real, and right here with you, is the very human habit of telling ourselves tales about who we are, what we could lose, and what might still be hidden just beyond the known world. So lie back at the edge of the map where the sea is dark and uncharted, and let the old island sink quietly out of sight. The waves will keep their secrets, the stars will keep their distance, and the story, like the tide, will still be there in the morning, waiting, whenever you feel like returning.